How God's providence and human free will coexist is a difficult question that comes up time and time again in the history of Christian thought. The various answers posed by theologians have often been diverse and complicated. I interviewed 5 people who have written on this topic about their differing understandings of freedom, and I simply want to present them here so that viewers can compare these ideas and think about them more deeply. I should be clear though, since I often make videos that focus on Christian universalism, that none of the people interviewed for this video are universalists, with the one obvious exception of Dr. David Bentley Hart. However, something I find interesting is that Christian universalists throughout history have taken different positions on this issue and have fallen all along the theological spectrum. There have been universalists who hold to libertarian free will, compatibilism, hard determinism, and other perspectives. But this question of the interplay of free will and providence is something all kinds of Christians contemplate and discuss. So let's look at some of the major positions on the issue that are being debated today. Let's start with 2 major positions that are usually discussed in Protestantism: Calvinism, which holds to a compatibilist understanding of freedom, and Arminianism, which holds to libertarian free will.
Human freedom and responsibility is compatible with divine determinism. In other words, God has decreed everything that takes place in time and space and history, and that would include all of the actions and decisions and things that human beings do, and so their decisions are compatible. Their freely made decisions, we might add, are compatible with God having determined them. And then to distinguish this sort of notion of freedom and responsibility that is assigned to compatibilistic freedom, if you want to call it that, as opposed to the more common view of free will, which would be known as libertarianism. The compatibilistic view of free will says that we always choose what we most want to choose. And what we most want to choose is always connected to our strongest, most compelling desires. And in turn, when those desires are connected to what we might call spiritual issues, they always proceed from the basic core nature of our spiritual condition. So in other words, if we are spiritually dead, then we can only make choices that proceed from our unregenerate nature. If we have been regenerated by the Holy Spirit, then we are capable of making choices that are truly God glorifying and not conditioned by our sinful nature per se. The Bible always locates moral responsibility in the intentions of the choosing agent. In other words, if I intend evil and I know that what I am doing is evil, so in other words, there's really 2 planks for moral responsibility from a biblical standpoint. And that is, first of all, that we have a moral conscience, that we know right and wrong. So that's the first plank of moral responsibility. The second is our intentions. God searches the heart, right? God judges us based on the heart. That's why Jesus says, if you lust after a woman, you've already committed adultery, right? Because it starts with the intention of your heart. It has nothing to do with whether or not you could have chosen otherwise, right? Moral responsibility is not in your mind. Well, I could choose to not lust after this woman, or I could choose to, and that's what grounds my moral responsibility. No, that's not what grounds your moral responsibility. It's always grounded simply in the intention of your heart. Just as Jesus is, praised for all the good things he does, he's not praised because he could have done otherwise, because Jesus couldn't have done otherwise. God could not do otherwise. He's always acts in a way that is good and truly righteous.
The Arminian understanding of free will is one in which all human beings, all people, are able to operate with a measure of their own libertarian actions. That is, all Christians believe that God is sovereign over all of the created realm. But within that sovereignty and within that realm, Arminians say that God allows a measure, in fact, even a great measure of free will, that every person is able to get up in the morning, is able to choose a job of their liking, to follow a path, and on any given moment, even be able to go right or to go left. And when it comes to the great question of salvation, an Arminian with libertarian free will maintains that God is going to allow the person to accept this invitation to the gospel, to believe, or to be able to reject that particular invitation. And so an Arminian view of free will is one which receives the phrase libertarian free will. And this is one which is not compatible with causal determinism. In particular, one thing that sets an Arminian view of free will over against some other views, this is that God can foreknow, simple foreknowledge. He can foreknow all future events, and that person who is a libertarian free will agent, that person can still make decisions, make choices without God's foreknowledge of that event being any form of limitation or any form of restriction or any form of determinism. And so this is what's usually represented as the classical Arminian view of free will. As we read the Bible, we do see this detrimental impact that sin has, that we're not able to make good decisions, but rather we tend to make selfish decisions that are even self-destructive. Arminians believe in a great depth of depravity. And John Wesley, of course, following Arminius on this, if everyone is so depraved and they can't choose good things, how are they able to respond to a gospel call or to give food to the poor or even to love and sacrifice to their neighbor? The answer is the doctrine of prevenient grace. This is the belief that God mitigates this fallen human condition so much or enough that people are able to operate with a measure of goodness because of God's grace, that the Spirit comes and he woos, he invites, he encourages, he even strengthens with a measure of faith so that the person who repents and believes in Christ for salvation, that they do this because of the grace of God, thus fulfilling the requirement of Paul in Ephesians 2:8-9. By grace you're saved through faith, and that not of yourself, but this is a gift of God.
A couple of other positions that espouse a libertarian view of freedom are quite popular in Christian circles these days as well: Molinism and open theism.
So in open theism, God knows all the past exhaustively and all the present events that are happening exhaustively. So there are no facts of the matter that God is unaware of. This view is called dynamic omniscience. So omniscience is ongoing. It's a dynamism. So as more present events, his events become present, God knows them. So God is always fully omniscient in this view. But it's dynamic. Okay? So there is no transcript of the future. There are no facts of the future. There's only possibilities of what could happen in the future. And God knows reality as it is. So God knows the future as possible and knows the present and the past as actual or factual. So why doesn't God know the future? Because it's not there to be known. That's the major reason. It does not exist. The problem when many critics hear this is, but the future does exist, and you're saying God doesn't know it, so God's not omniscient, right? I mean, that makes sense, right? If there's an object on my desk, a pen, let's say, an ink pen, and God doesn't know it, well, then God's ignorant about that, right? So, but we're saying the future does not exist. It's not a reality. So this is similar to the definition of omnipotence that Aquinas used and almost all Christians use today. It's not universal, but it's like 99%. And that definition of omnipotence is God can do anything that's logically possible. So God cannot make, for instance, a colorless blue automobile. That's a logical impossibility, blue and colorless. Okay, so God can't do that. Okay? So, and so we're saying the future is not knowable because it does not exist. God knows all existence.
Molinism is known for advocating a libertarian understanding of human freedom. The thing that probably is distinctive about Molinism in this regard is that it has a high view of divine providence. That is, we believe that God is able to accomplish his will with precision and success. And he does so primarily by means of his omniscience. But we argue that even a God who knows all propositional truths and is able to meticulously accomplish his will, that the free creatures that he created have been created with significant human freedom. And by significant, we mean it in a libertarian sense. We are classic theists in the sense that Molinists hold to the view that God knows all propositional truths. This means he has exhaustive knowledge of the future. And this would put us in contrast with perhaps open theists or process theologians, and puts us more in the traditional camp of that, yes, God knows the past, present, and the future. So the question then it comes up then is, if God knows all things, including those subjunctive conditionals, those things that could have been otherwise, hypothetically, yet he knows what I'm going to do in that situation, am I really free? That, in other words, if God knows that this evening, if I'm going to have a ham sandwich or a bowl of chili, I have these two choices before me. Which one do I want? Well, if God already knows which one I'm going to choose, and he's never wrong in his knowledge, then is it possible that I could have done otherwise? Well, Molinism addresses that, and that's one of the things it's intended to do. But Molina went a step further. He argued not only is it possible for free creatures to be genuinely free in a world in which the biblical God of classic theism exists, but this God is able to use this knowledge to accomplish his will in a way that he's able to get done what he wants to get done. At the same time, it does not violate or negate the free choices that humans make. And so if God knows all subjunctive conditionals that relate to human freedom, what kind of knowledge is this? I mean, you think about it, classic theism affirms at least two different types or moments to God's knowledge. That is, they know that God knows some things that are true just by virtue of his nature. Classic theism, by and large, has said there are certain things that are true due to the very nature of God, and therefore they are necessarily true. They cannot be otherwise. And you think of all of the virtues, all of the things such as, the attributes of God in terms of goodness, righteousness. God could not create a world in which he is evil and therefore evil is good. These things, good, that which is good and right and holy and pure are necessarily that way. And so those are known as necessary truths. And they would say, does God know everything about that? And they'd say, yeah, that's his natural knowledge. That's where we get the word for natural knowledge. And they'd say, okay, and yet God has freedom, and he is free to not create the world at all if he so chooses. He has an infinite set of worlds that he possibly could have created. He decides to create this one, the world in which you and I reside, this world in which we live, is a world in which he freely chose it. So he knows everything that's true about this world. So that's why it's known as his free knowledge. And so you have two types of knowledge: that which is true according to God's nature, and that which is true according to God's will. And so those are the two moments that I don't know hardly any classic theologian would disagree with. So that would be God's natural knowledge and God's free knowledge. Well, what about God's knowledge of conditional statements that free creatures, namely humans in this situation, we could or could do or may not do? In fact, he knows all of this, what we call counterfactual knowledge. He has this infinite repository of counterfactual knowledge. Well, is it his knowledge of this? Does it belong to his natural knowledge? Well, no, it's not of necessity. We just got through saying it's conditional. Well, is it part of his free knowledge? No, God may not even ordain any of those things to happen. So there's somehow this body of knowledge that God has is in between his natural knowledge and his free knowledge. Well, it's in between. So what are we going to call it? Middle knowledge. And so Molinists will argue that God has middle knowledge, which is this knowledge of all of the free choices humans could make in particular scenarios, possible worlds, and that God can use that knowledge to choose and select scenarios in which he can now accomplish his will perfectly, utilizing his knowledge of what free creatures would do in any particular scenario. So that's Molinism in a nutshell. You have three moments to God's knowledge: his natural knowledge, his middle knowledge, and his free knowledge. And God utilizes his middle knowledge to accomplish his will in the world at which we live.
Why do free will theists generally reject compatibilistic free will? Well, it ultimately leaves God culpable for moral evil, because God could easily guarantee, now this is the key word. See, in libertarian freedom, God cannot guarantee what you and I will do without removing our freedom. God cannot guarantee and prevent me from committing a moral evil, doing something unloving to somebody, because I have libertarian freedom. But if you have compatibilistic freedom, God could guarantee that there would be no moral evil, and that everybody would only do good things and love each other. And so then you're back to the question, oh boy, that sounds like a pretty good world. Why didn't God do that one?
I would argue that Molinism achieves what many of my Calvinist brethren would like to achieve. And that is, we want to make sure that everything that is good and gracious, God gets the credit. That as Paul says, for by the grace of God that I am what I am. And he talks about laboring more abundantly than the other apostles, but yet it was not I, but it was the grace of God that works in me. And so, like my Calvinist brethren, we're able to say that all good things are by God's grace. At the very same time, we are able to say something that I think my Calvinist brethren struggle with saying, and that is, every sin that is committed is my responsibility. I'm the one who did it. I think that causal determinism is pastorally disastrous. Imagine trying to deal with a family situation where the husband is being unfaithful, or the wife is being unfaithful, and yet if they believe in causal determinism, God made me to be unfaithful. I could not have done otherwise. So how are you blaming me for something that God ordained? And not only God ordained, but God was the efficient cause of it.
This topic can be very time-consuming and complicated, but there's another perspective that's worth thinking about as well, a classical understanding of free will. So how should we understand this ancient position?
You have to ask a number of questions. What is freedom? What is the will? And then what is freedom of the will? And then what is the free exercise of the will? In the modern age, we tend to think of freedom in terms of pure libertarian power to choose whatever end we choose to choose. But even the way I put that, you notice, already invokes a kind of infinite regress, because pure libertarianism would be the ability to choose with absolute spontaneity, that is, not prompted towards a certain end by a rationale that commands the will in any way. But if you think about that, then if the will were pure spontaneity, that would mean that actually it's not free. Because pure spontaneity is an event that happens to you, not something that you actually deliberatively elect for yourself. So the first thing you have to do to think intelligently about free will is to try to detach yourself from the modern concept of voluntarist freedom that consists simply in the power of choice, and ask what it would really mean to be free as a rational being. And that would seem to be, you are free to do that which rationally you intend to do, that which is a purpose for you according to an unclouded mind's apprehension of its best end. So, retreat from there. If we go back to the classical model of freedom, all it means is the capacity to accomplish one's own nature without impediment, to reach the end that is supremely and connately desirable to you without extrinsic or intrinsic obstacles. There are intrinsic obstacles, simply such as ignorance, such as dementia, physical incapacity. So in that sense, in the classical sense, only God is perfectly free, because nothing can prevent God from being who and what he is in his fullness, right? But God doesn't have to make any choices. I mean, God isn't confronted with, a wider landscape of possibilities that he has to choose among. What makes him infinitely free is the total absence of choice. He's not confronted with hard decisions. And something analogous is true of us. That to be truly free would simply be to be so free of ignorance, inhibition, uncertainty, the wounds of our finite nature, all the things that inhibit us from becoming that which in our deepest nature we most will to be. We would then achieve our end, never really having to choose it. I mean, it would be simply the free expression of our natures arriving at its intrinsic telos. When you make a choice, you make a choice after having made a judgment. You make a judgment after having made an evaluation. And the evaluation is based on a prior set of values that you conceive of either concretely or just in a sort of unthematized transcendental way, like goodness, truth. You say what it is you think you freely want to will is discovering the truth of something. You're confronted with a situation, you evaluate this or that as true or false, or this or that is likely to yield the true. Having made that evaluation, you make the judgment that this is the course you'll pursue, and then you do so, right? So in order for you to be free in that case, there are two levels of operation going on, right? At one level, there's a prior, let's call it transcendental desire for some value in itself that's absolute, the good, the true, the beautiful, the one. Whatever it is that absolutely, absorbingly, irresistibly attracts your nature. And then at the level of the deliberative self, you sadly, with all your limitations as a finite being, are confronted with finite choices in regard to that horizon of values that you implicitly desire. and in either greater or lesser degree, with better or worse success, you make choices that are in keeping with that thing which your nature chiefly desires. But given the complexity of life, and given all the ways in which we are injured and limited, it's impossible to say with certainty that in many ways, to a great degree, these choices are already made for us. So, to become truly free, it would be progressively to be liberated from those impediments. It wouldn't be simply, to have more choices. I often like to use the language of Maximus the Confessor here and say we have a natural will which can only intend the good. That's not a psychological will. It doesn't belong to our empirical ego. It's not an individual possession. It's simply that our nature yearns for its full flourishing in union with the one good, which is God, in a way that is in keeping with the nature that we possess. Then there's the gnomic will, the deliberative will, which exists actually when because of our finite and imperfect grasp of reality, and then because of other extrinsic impediments, we have to make choices without an absolute knowledge and without the sort of absolute freedom that perfect knowledge and perfect capacity would give us. So, yes, for me, freedom has very little to do with libertarian choice. That's, if anything, the barest residue of real freedom. Our real freedom is in the natural will. The deliberative will is seeking to become free by conforming itself to the natural will. So, in the circumstances of life, do we really, could we do other than we have? I think, there's no way of answering that, as I say, no way of answering that intelligibly. Probably yes, in the sense that there's always a kind of indeterminacy that, the Buridan's ass, right? The dilemma is that the ass is posed between two equally desirable sacks of grain. It wants to feed, but this is a perfectly rational ass, right? So there's no reason why one should be preferred over the other, and hence he, being perfectly rational, never chooses and starves to death, which is the ultimate error. But of course, I think it was Spinoza pointed out that the act of choice itself is a rational necessity, right? When you're confronted with that reality, not to choose is more irrational than to choose spontaneously. So you make the rational choice to make a spontaneous choice. And in that way, spontaneity becomes a function of freedom. You see, it's sort of redeemed in that in pursuing the natural end, surviving the good, not starving to death, you can redeem spontaneity by making it in itself serve a rational end, right? And I think life is full of moments like that. I think we do actually make determinations that are choices to choose, As long as those choices are in keeping with the natural desire for the good, then that act is enfolded within our rational capacities. As an actual empirical fact, whether their situation usually constrains us in ways we don't understand to choose one rather than the other, I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about the transcendental horizon of rational spirit. I would have to be God to answer that properly, I know that just as in God, freedom and necessity are not distinct from one another. It's meaningless to think in those terms. God simply is. Actuality as such. So just being infinitely God is an act of infinite freedom, but it's not a choice among, different ways to be God as though he were a finite being. That we are freer the more our deliberative will coincides with our natural will. In the Anglophone world, we're often asked, and this is, the modern terms, to choose between affirming so-called compatibilism and libertarianism. And to my mind, this is a ridiculous choice to be asked to make. I mean, the way compatibilism is defined is so broad that it would put Daniel Dennett and Thomas Aquinas in one camp over against the pure libertarian. So I want to emphasize again that what I said earlier, keep it in mind, is that there are two different levels of operation here. And it's because the natural will is determined towards absolute ends that fulfill its nature and that are coincident with the nature of God, that the deliberative will is capable of making choices. So it's on the one hand, it's an absolute determination, total, that cannot be resisted. Your nature has only one true end, which is God, and your nature in itself desires only that end. Everything in the world that's desirable to you is merely a symbol or a contraction or a mode or a distraction from that one good end that as a natural being at the level of transcendental motivation you desire. But it's precisely that determination which sets the deliberative will free to whatever degree it's truly free. Not in the libertarian sense of absolute spontaneity, which again would not be freedom, but precisely because it has a teleology rather than a mechanical prior cause prompting it. The way spontaneous would be just pure mechanism, right? It would be like a volcano or, an embolism and, or having a stroke. That behavior is totally spontaneous. And that's why it's totally unfree.
So now that we've briefly explored 5 major positions, one of the most serious questions that each view has to consider pertains to the existence of sin. Why would God create a world with the intention, or foreknowledge, or at least known risk, that sin would, or at least might, come about?
Okay, so you have risks on the beginning, God creating this kind of world. God could have created a different kind of world. God created this kind of world. And in the eschaton, well, what about the eschaton? Is God going to get what God wants? And I think it really comes down to the confidence God has in God's abilities, in God's love, in God's communication. And so, this may not be a great example, but say you're going to teach a class. And is there a risk that all the students in that class misunderstand what you say and react in hatred towards you? Yeah, that's a possible risk. Well, then why would you teach the class? Well, personally, maybe I'm just cocky, but I'm confident in my abilities to teach, to share, to love the students. Now, is it a guarantee that every single one of them will understand what I said? Well, I've taught, for 40 years, and believe me, there's no way to guarantee that everyone in a classroom. And sometimes they come into my office and say, well, when you said this, I said, what? No. So is there a guarantee that everyone will understand and respond lovingly? No. But if you are confident in your abilities, and I believe God is maximally confident in the divine abilities to love and to communicate, well, God says, yeah, I'll take the risk of creating a world with libertarian creatures. Now, what about the eschaton? Can God guarantee? Can Providence, Well, again, we're seeing, I think we have thousands of years of human history to see that God is being successful. And that God is working towards greater success.
Why did God allow the fall and why does God allow evil? Because he wants to sanctify us and he wants us to respond with obedience for his glory. And perhaps this is even a greater glory when free will agents honor and obey God than when non-free will agents simply do that which God requires of them in a more deterministic system.
Sin is a possibility in the very act of creating finite beings. They're not, real rational agents if they are not genuinely created ex nihilo. They come into being with an absolute past and non-being and an absolute future in union with God. So, it would be impossible even for God to create free creatures in a sort of in the condition of, say, a dramatis persona, someone who is always, created already past the possibility of sin, death, dereliction, falsehood. So it's not part of the plan. I mean, it doesn't have a dialectical role to play in the achievement of the end, but it is, a transient possibility written into the very act of creating free rational agents.
Evil, ultimately, no matter how horrendous it might be, can never be gratuitous. In other words, the word gratuitous there meaning something that occurs that has no reason, no purpose. It's just senseless. It's meaningless. And we can think of all kinds of horrendous evil. We could think of the Holocaust. The Holocaust seems like a massive gratuitous evil, right? That's just completely senseless. And there's a sense in which I think it's okay for us to say that, right? Because we can't see in our minds, we can't see anything good that came out of the Holocaust. And yet God would have never allowed the Holocaust, permitted the Holocaust, if you want to use that kind of language, and I'm okay with that, would have never permitted the Holocaust if he did not have some greater purpose, some greater good ultimately for that occurring. And so God in his superintendence of all things evil always has some greater good that he intends to bring out of that evil. Otherwise, I don't think God would ever intend that evil to take place. The thing that brings God the greatest glory required evil, right? Redemption requires something to be redeemed. It requires a state of crisis that cries out for redemption. It cries out for a hero who would come and intervene and defeat evil. And that's exactly what Jesus Christ did in his death and resurrection. God would have no opportunity to display his grace and mercy unless there was evil in the world. In determining and decreeing the fall to take place, God then opened the door for redemption to happen, to bring glory to himself, to bring supreme glory to himself.
One of the things that classic theism struggles with is, how is it that the God of the Bible, being as good as he is and as powerfully as he is, would create a world in which he creates beings that rebelled against him? I mean, let's remember, Adam joined a rebellion that was already underway, according to the scriptural narrative, that you have, it's not just humans doing what we're doing, that there are entities besides us, spiritual powers that are at war with God. And so there is this cosmic war. So the question comes, how can it be that the God of the Bible is, that he's sovereign, that he's all powerful, all knowing, all good, but he creates this kind of world, and in which there is this window of time in which things go terribly wrong. In this window of time in which you and I are presently in, this era of time and space, is it possible for God to create free creatures, so free that we can go off the reservation and do bad things? And we're arguing yes. Compatibilism cannot do that without making God the author of sin. I don't understand how there can be any type of true responsibility for sin unless one has the ability at significant times to have chosen otherwise.
Of course, so many other questions could be asked in relation to free will and providence, but I hope this brief overview of a few of the major positions in Christian thought is helpful in thinking through a little more this sometimes difficult topic.